The name he kept forgetting. At room 203, you don't knock. You hum. Just 3 notes. The opening of an old folk song he once sang as a boy. That's how we knew if he was awake, calm, or drifting. Mr. Than. He was 84. Wiry hands, eyes like faded glass, and a memory that came and went like tide. He never remembered my name. Not once. Sometimes I was the boy from the post office, sometimes the nurse with the banana shirt. Once he called me Ben and apologized for breaking my toy truck. But every day, like clockwork, he would look out the window and whisper, "Has Thu come back yet?" At first, I thought Thu was a nurse, or maybe his daughter, a visitor who never showed up. "Who is Thu?" I asked one morning. He stared at me for a while, then in a voice too soft to stand on. The one I loved most and somehow managed to forget. He didn't say anything else that day. Just hummed those same 3 notes. Over and over. 1 week later, while helping him fold laundry, I found a photo under his pillow. Worn, folded, edges curled like old leaves. In it, a young girl in a white audai, laughing with her head tilted back. Behind her, a boy, barefoot, gap-toothed, holding a guitar made of scrap wood. "Is that you?" I asked. He squinted. "Who's that boy again? Maybe try?" I blinked. "But your name is Than." He stared at the photo again, then turned it over. On the back, in neat cursive, Thu and Then 1960. Ani, first time singing together. You'll be the melody and I'll be the voice that follows. He traced the words with a trembling finger, then whispered, "So, that was me?" Funny how I forgot myself, but not her. He forgot himself, but never her. I began to ask around. Turns out no one had heard of a Thu visiting him. No one knew the full story, not even the nurses who'd worked there for years. So I did what I always do. I listened. Some days, Mr. Than told me they sang on the radio together. Other days, he said she was a teacher who gave him his first notebook. Once, he claimed she was a bird. She flew away. No one could keep her. But no matter the version, the ending was always the same. I lost her, and I can't remember how. One afternoon, he was especially quiet, staring out the window. I sat beside him. "What's your name again?" he asked me. I smiled. "Jason, my name's Jason." He nodded. "Jason, have you ever loved someone?" I laughed. "Yes, Mr. Than, but we broke up." He looked at me seriously. "Do you still remember her name?" I nodded again. "Of course." He gave a faint smile. "Then you haven't forgotten her." Just like me. That night, I wrote in my journal, he forgets everything, but not her name, not her laugh, not the way she walked into a room and made music follow her. Love, real love, is maybe the one thing Alzheimer can't erase, not fully. Not if it was sung enough times. A month later, Mr. Than passed in his sleep. Peacefully. Hands folded, a faint smile on his lips. We found one last note under his bed written on an old napkin. "Though, if you haven't made it back in time, I'll wait." The postcard in her pillowcase. She didn't talk much, didn't like noise, didn't like questions. But every morning, without fail, she'd sit by the window, holding a cup of warm tea she rarely sipped, and ask, "Has my son written back yet?" Her name was Ms. Evelyn, 87. Soft white hair always tied back with a blue ribbon, skin thin as parchment, and a voice that trembled at the end of every sentence. Like it wasn't sure whether it should speak or stop. She didn't remember my name either. Called me Sweetie most days. Tommy on others. But I remembered hers. And more importantly, I remembered the weight in her voice when she asked that question again and again. "Has he written yet?" At first, I didn't ask. It seemed too personal, too sacred. But one morning, as I changed her pillowcase, I felt something stiff and folded beneath it. A postcard. It was old, edges frayed. Front, a watercolor painting of a beach at sunset. The kind sold in gift shops in small towns that only tourists remember. On the back, just 3 words in delicate cursive. "I forgive you." No address, no stamp, just those words. And at the bottom, a name, Erin. When I turned to her, she was watching me. "You found it, didn't you?" I nodded, unsure. She smiled. But it was the kind of smile that hid behind a wall of memory. "He never got it," she said. "I wrote it, but I couldn't send it." We sat together on the edge of the bed, the rain outside tapping gently against the window pane. "Why not?" I asked softly. She looked away. "Because I waited too long. By the time I wanted to forgive him, he didn't want to be forgiven anymore." She told me slowly, like someone peeling old wallpaper, one fragile layer at a time. Her son, Aaron, had left home at 17. Angry, ashamed, broken. Because of something she said, or didn't say, or said the wrong way. She didn't remember the words, but she remembered the silence that followed them. For years. He called once, she whispered. Years later, just to tell me he was alive, that he'd found someone, that he was happy. Her hands trembled, and I told him not to call again, that if he couldn't live the way I raised him, he shouldn't live in my memory either. She stopped, closed her eyes. I thought I was protecting my pride, but really, I was destroying the only bridge left. She wrote the postcard the next day. Wanted to say sorry. Wanted to say she loved him still, but she never mailed it. I didn't think he'd want it anymore, she said, and I didn't want to hear that he didn't. So she placed it under her pillow, where it stayed for 40 years. Do you think, she asked suddenly, it still matters, a message never sent? I looked at her. I think some messages still arrive, even if they never leave the room. She smiled, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. Sweetie, that's a lovely thing to say. The next day, I made a quiet call. It took time, records, paperwork, permission. But eventually I found him, Aaron, now in his 50s, living just 2 hours away, still waiting in some way for something that never came. He agreed to come, just once, just to see her, but only if she remembered. I told him, she might not know your name, but she never forgot your place in her story. He arrived on a rainy Thursday. She was sitting by the window, as always. When he entered, she didn't speak, just looked at him for a long, long time. Then, her voice shaking, she whispered, has my son come back yet? And Aaron, with tears sliding down his face, sat beside her, held her hand and said, he never left. That night, she slept with the postcard on her chest. And in the morning, she didn't ask the question again, because maybe, in the end, she received the only reply she ever truly needed. The woman who mistook me for her sister, her name was Ms. Helen, 83, elegant in a way that lingered even as memory faded. She wore pearls every morning, lipstick that didn't always match, and perfume that smelled like old rosewood and youth long gone. She never called me by my name, not once. To her, I was always, Lynn, you're late again, she said the first time I brought her tea. Mother's going to scold you. I opened my mouth to correct her, but something in her tone, a mixture of playfulness and pain, made me stay silent. I simply smiled. Sorry I'm late. She nodded and began to talk. Not to me, but to Lynn. That day, she told me about a night in 1956, the summer they snuck out of the house barefoot. She and Lynn, two sisters, one bold, one careful. We hid under the bridge, she said, just to listen to the neighbor boy play his violin. He thought no one was watching. She laughed. Lynn was in love, but she never said a word, just listened. And every time he played, she pressed her hand against her chest, like her heart would leap out if she let it. Every visit after that, Ms. Helen told me another story, always about Lynn, the sister who danced in the hallway at night, who once carved a poem into the closet wall, who sang to herself in the bath. She was music, Ms. Helen whispered once, everything I wasn't. But then the stories changed, darker, slower, less laughter. She left, she said one day, packed her bags without a goodbye, just left a letter on the table. I waited. What did it say? She didn't answer, only stared at the ceiling, eyes glossy with something unshed. A week later, I brought her fresh flowers. She didn't smile. Instead, she said, I was the one who told Father about the violin boy, about the letters, about their plans to run away. She clutched the blanket tightly. I thought if I told him she'd stay. She paused, bitter. But Father sent her away instead. I didn't know what to say. She looked at me suddenly, sharp and clear. Do you hate me, Lynn? I froze. Her hands reached for mine. I was jealous of how you loved, of how you lived, and in one moment, oh, man, I ruined everything. Her voice cracked. You never came back. And I waited. I waited so long that even your face started to fade. So now, when I see yours, I pretend you're still here. So I can finally say I'm sorry. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I never got to say it, so please, Lynn, just say you forgive me, even if it's a lie. I held her hand and said, I forgive you. She smiled, closed her eyes. And for a moment, I swear I saw the girl she once was, the one who danced in hallways but couldn't sing. The next morning, I found a small envelope tucked in the drawer beside her bed. Inside, a photo. 2 girls on a bicycle, one holding a violin, the other clinging to her waist, laughing into the wind. On the back, written in faded ink, Lynn and Helen, summer 1955, sisters, secrets, a song we never finished. The man who waited in the lobby at 3 p.m. every day at exactly 2:55 p.m., he would shuffle to the same blue chair in the lobby. Always the blue one. Always the one facing the door. His name was Mr. Lewis, 89. Tall, thin, with sharp cheekbones and always wearing a tie. even on Sundays when no one visited. Especially on Sundays, he never talked much, just sat, hands folded neatly over a manila folder, eyes fixed on the entrance like it owed him something. The nurses said it had become a routine. Part of the dementia, they said, that he thinks someone is coming, but no one ever came. The first time I asked him who he was waiting for, he said, "My daughter, she's coming to sign the papers." "What papers?" I asked. He held up the folder. Inside, blank pages. Just blank. Every day at 3 p.m., he'd open the folder, flip through it slowly, nod, then close it again. "She's just running late," he'd say. I started sitting with him. Not every day, but enough. We didn't talk much, but once in a while he'd tell me things. Little things. She liked orange soda, said it reminded her of childhood. Used to braid her doll's hair while I made breakfast. Said she'd never leave me behind. And then, like clockwork, he'd look at the door and add, "She promised she'd come back." One afternoon, a nurse leaned over to me and whispered, "Mr. Lewis never had a daughter. His wife passed before they could have kids. He's just stuck in something that never happened." I nodded, but didn't say anything, because I wasn't sure she was right. One rainy Tuesday, I sat beside him as usual. We were quiet. Then he turned to me and asked, "Do you think I made her up?" I hesitated, then said, "Do you remember how she made you feel?" He nodded, like I mattered. Then maybe, I said, "She was real where it counted." He smiled. First time I'd seen him do that. "You're a smart boy," he said. "Maybe even smarter than her." Then he paused. "But don't tell her I said that." That day, I left a sticky note inside his folder when he wasn't looking. It read, "Sorry I'm late, Dad, I didn't forget. Your girl." The next day, he didn't say a word. Just opened the folder, read the note, and held it to his chest. His hands shook. He didn't cry, but I think he wanted to. For the next week, he stopped checking the door every 5 seconds. Still came to sit, still wore a tie. But now with a kind of peace, as if someone had finally arrived. On the 9th day, he didn't show up. Didn't come to the lobby. Didn't put on his tie. He passed quietly in his sleep, folder by his bedside, note still inside. At the funeral, no one claimed him. No relatives, no daughter. But I placed the folder on his casket. Tucked the note where his hands would have held it. Because maybe, just maybe, some stories are more real when they're believed than when they're proven. The shoes she polished every Sunday. There was a small wooden bench by the laundry room. Not fancy, just chipped paint and a few splinters too stubborn to let go. But every Sunday at 9 a.m. sharp, Ms. Rosa would sit there, with a small tin of polish, a rag, and a pair of men's black leather shoes. She never spoke, just worked, rubbing, buffing, breathing, as if she was shining memory itself. The shoes were too big for her. Clearly not hers. Old-fashioned, narrow at the tip, worn at the heels. I watched her do it for weeks, always the same routine. No one else paid attention. Rituals, a nurse said, part of her confusion. But I wasn't so sure. There was something reverent about the way she touched them. Like they were sacred. Like they once belonged to someone who never made it back. One Sunday, I approached. "Ms. Rosa, those are nice shoes." She didn't look up. "They're not mine," she whispered. "Whose are they?" She paused, then said, "His." That was all she said for the rest of the morning. But the next week, when I brought her tea, she began to speak. Danny was 7 when he picked them. Too big for him, but he said, "I'll grow into them, Mama." She smiled, bittersweet. Every year on his birthday, he'd try them on again, still too big, until one day they fit. I didn't interrupt. She continued. He wanted to be a teacher, or maybe a chef. Changed his mind every other day. But one thing never changed. He always wanted to make me proud. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped the toe of the left shoe. On the day he turned 19, he left for the army. She stopped, looked down at her hands. He told me, "Don't cry, Mama. I'll be home by Christmas. These shoes still need to take me dancing." She never said what happened next, but I knew. We all did. The silence said it louder than any headline. "He never came back," she said a week later, her voice small, like it came from somewhere far away. But his shoes did. Arrived in a box, no note, just shoes and a flag. I sat beside her. "Why do you polish them every Sunday?" She looked at me, eyes not clouded by memory, but crystal clear. "Because he wanted them to shine. And if he ever finds his way back, I want him to see I never stopped waiting." That afternoon, I noticed something I hadn't before. The right shoe was slightly more worn than the left, like someone had danced more with their dominant foot. Like a boy had stood in front of a mirror, practicing steps he never got to show. The next Sunday, I brought her polish before she even asked. She smiled. "You're a good boy, Tommy." "My name's not Tommy," I said gently. She looked confused for a moment, then said, "Danny had a friend named Tommy, always brought him orange candies. You remind me of him." She started to polish. And I watched. This time, not just the shoes, but her. The way she moved, the way she paused after each stroke. Like remembering was as much a ritual as forgetting. A few months later, Ms. Rosa passed peacefully. Her shoes, Danny's shoes, were placed at the foot of her bed. I asked the nurse what would happen to them. Usually we donate unclaimed items, she said. I nodded, but that night I took the shoes home. I keep them on a shelf by my window. Still shine them every Sunday. Not because I knew Danny, but because now I do. The song he couldn't finish, he played the piano with only 2 fingers, index and middle. The others trembled too much. Still, he played. Every afternoon. Same song, same 4 lines. Mr. Eli. 85, suit jacket 2 sizes too big, eyes soft like candlelight. He never remembered what came after the 4th line. He'd pause, wait, press a wrong key, then chuckle. Guess I never wrote the rest. The melody was haunting, simple, like something you'd hum while watching rain slide down glass. It lingered long after he stopped playing. I sat beside him one day, listened again, watched his hands, bones in memory, float over the keys. What's it called? I asked. He looked up. It didn't have a name. I was waiting for her to give it one. Who was she? He smiled. Her name was Maya, a dancer. She moved like the wind had something to prove. He told me how they met, at a summer camp in the mountains. He played guitar. She choreographed a dance to his music. And one night they sat by a fire and promised they'd meet again in 10 years. She said, if we're still breathing, we owe it to the song. He waited. 10 years, same spot. She never came. Maybe she forgot. Maybe she moved on. Maybe she didn't breathe long enough. He never wrote another song after that. Only the one. 4 lines. Played it every week for 60 years. Trying to remember what came next. One Thursday, something strange happened. A new nurse passed by as he was playing. She froze, then turned back, eyes wide. That song, she whispered. I know that song. Mr. Eli stopped. Looked at her. You can't, it's mine. She sat down beside him. Hummed the same 4 lines. Then kept going. A 5th line, then a 6th. A soft crescendo that rose, fell, then landed perfectly where his memory always stopped. He stared at her. Where did you learn that? She pulled out a piece of folded paper from her pocket. Gently unfolded it. Inside, a yellowing letter, with sheet music and a note. For Maya, in case I forget how it ends. It was his handwriting. He shook his head. I wrote this? The nurse nodded. I'm Maya's granddaughter. She kept this with her until she passed. She said if anyone ever played those 4 lines, I should finish it. So the music would find its way home. Mr. Eli didn't speak, just leaned forward, placed his hand on the piano, and played the song again. This time, all the way through. When he reached the end, his hands stilled. Tears fell. Not from sadness, but from something closer to completion. She remembered, he whispered, even when I didn't. After that, he never played it again. Didn't need to. The song had finally landed, found its ending, found its name. We printed the sheet music, framed it above the piano. At the top, in gold lettering, The Last Dance for Maya, and underneath, in smaller script, if you forget the melody, let someone else sing it back to you. The room with 2 toothbrushes. Her room was always tidy. Not sterile, but lovingly kept. Curtains drawn just enough for morning light. Flowers in a chipped vase by the window, and on the bathroom sink, 2 toothbrushes. 1 blue, 1 green. They sat in the same cup, always lined up perfectly. Ms. Agnes, 86. Soft curls of silver hair. Voice gentle like bedtime stories. And eyes that looked like they were always waiting. Every morning around 7 a.m., she'd go into the bathroom, brush her teeth, and then reach for the second brush. She'd wet it, hold it delicately, and brush as if someone were standing in front of her. Carefully, thoroughly, lovingly. I watched from the doorway once, curious, confused. There was no one there. Just her, the mirror, and the green toothbrush. She noticed me watching and smiled. It's his turn now. I asked her gently, whose toothbrush is that? She looked at it, then at me. My husband's. He hates mint toothpaste, but it's all they have here. So I brush it softly, so he doesn't complain too much. I didn't have the heart to say he wasn't there. Didn't have the courage to ask where he really was. Because something in her voice said he still existed. At least, in that space between memory and morning. She told me about him one afternoon. His name was George. They met at a library. She dropped a book. He picked it up and said, I've been waiting for someone to read this with me. They married young, Had no children, traveled the world on small paychecks and large dreams. He called her Ginger because of the way she danced. Like you're steeped in something warm, he once said. She kept brushing that second toothbrush for 15 years after he passed. Why? I asked. She looked up from her tea, smiling softly. Because we promised to start every day together, even the ones when one of us couldn't. She said George had been diagnosed before her. Alzheimer's too, but his came quickly. One morning he looked at me and said, "Why are you in my house?" She laughed gently. Broke my heart, but I still brushed his teeth that day. When he passed, she kept his routine. Not because she was lost, but because she remembered. For both of them. She began forgetting more things over time. Names, dates, sometimes where she put her slippers, but never the toothbrushes, never his brush. One morning I brought her breakfast. She was sitting quietly by the window. The toothbrush cup was empty, both brushes gone. I asked her where they were. She smiled. He brushed his own teeth today, said I didn't have to anymore. She passed later that week. Peacefully. No pain. Just a long breath that never came back. When we cleared her room, I found a letter taped inside the bathroom cabinet. In neat cursive, to whoever finds this, if you're wondering why there were 2 toothbrushes, love isn't about grand gestures. Sometimes it's brushing for 2, long after one is gone. The day she forgot her own name, she no longer answered to anything. Not Mrs. Carter, not Mom, not Margaret. Even when spoken gently, even when sung like a lullaby, the names slid off her like rain on glass. Ms. Margaret had forgotten herself. When I walked into her room each morning, I used to say cheerfully, "Good morning, Margaret." But lately, she'd only blink, then ask, "Are you here to take me home?" Her room had no family photos, no cards, no visitors. The nurses said her husband passed years ago. No children, no siblings left, no one on file. She had no past. At least not one anyone remembered. Until one day, while cleaning her cabinet, I found a shoebox. Tied with a faded red ribbon, tucked behind old books she never read anymore. Inside, a single photograph. 2 girls in matching dresses, barefoot, holding hands in a field of wildflowers. And behind them, in faded ink, "To my darling Maggie, love always, L." I brought the photo to her. Didn't say anything. She stared at it, silent. Then softly, almost in a whisper, she said, "Lena." It was the first word she had spoken on her own in days. And not just any word. A name. One name with weight and warmth. She touched the edge of the photo with trembling fingers. Lena had golden hair, she said, smelled like mint and mischief. For the next week, Margaret, who had forgotten herself, began talking. But not about the weather. Not about her husband. Not about this place. Only about Lena. She called me Mags even when I hated it. We used to sneak out at night to lie on the roof and name stars. She promised we'd grow old together even if the world didn't want us to. She never said the word, not once. Not love, not girlfriend, not partner. Just Lena. But it was enough. Because the way she said it, soft, sacred, secret, you knew. You just knew. I asked the head nurse if she'd ever heard of Lena. She looked confused, checked old files, nothing. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, her family, they never talked about anything before her marriage. Maybe Lena was from a time they didn't accept. One evening, I sat beside her while she stared out the window. She turned to me and asked, "What's my name again?" "Margaret," I said gently. She smiled. "No, that's what they called me." Then she held up the photo again. I was Mags when I was happiest. Later that night, she asked for a pen. She couldn't hold it steady. Her hand shook, but she wrote anyway, on the back of the photo. "If I forget who I am, remind me I was loved." She passed in her sleep 2 nights later. Peaceful. Quiet. Photo on her chest. At her bedside table, we found a small velvet box. Inside, a silver ring. Delicate. Worn with time. And a note. I bought this for her. But I never got the chance. The world wasn't ready for us. We buried the photo with her. And the ring. Because some stories, even if never told aloud, deserve a resting place beside the heart they belong to. The wall of unsent letters, Mr. Bennett didn't talk much. He played chess alone in the corner of the rec room, moved both sides with remarkable precision, and never let himself win. He had no visitors, no birthday cards, no emergency contacts. "Never married," someone said. "No kids," said another. He was just a quiet man with sad eyes and good posture. When I first met him, he was folding paper. Crisp, perfect folds. Every single sheet tucked exactly in half. Blank pages over and over again. When I asked what he was doing, he simply said, "Practicing." "Practicing what?" He didn't say. Mr. Bennett passed away quietly in his sleep on a Thursday morning. No struggle, no sound. He had requested no funeral. No service, just the simplest goodbye possible. So we packed up his room. That's when we found it. The back panel of his wardrobe, a plain oak piece that looked untouched for decades, shifted slightly when we pulled out the last drawer. Behind it, a hollow space, hidden, intentional. Inside, stacked in neat columns, tied with twine, letters, hundreds. Every envelope addressed to the same name. To my son. No stamp, no address, just that. We opened one, then another, then another. Each letter dated, each signed, each written in careful, emotional detail. Today I saw a boy with your eyes. He laughed like you might have. You're 3 now. I wonder if you like puzzles like I did. I missed your birthday again. I didn't forget it. I just didn't think I had the right to say it out loud. They told me to stay away, but love doesn't work that way. It became clear. Mr. Bennett had a son he had never seen. Or perhaps only once. A son he had written to every week for over 40 years, but never sent a single letter. Why? Shame? Regret? A promise he was forced to make? We didn't know, but the words told us everything else. There were drawings, photos, tickets to concerts he never attended, receipts for toys never gifted, a lock of hair in a tiny plastic bag, all tucked between pages like confessions. One letter near the end read, "If someone ever finds these, and he's still out there, tell him I never stopped writing. I just didn't think he'd want to read them. But I needed to say them anyway." We sat in silence for a long time that night. The letters spread across the floor like footprints leading home from a path no one walked. I took one box of them home. Just one. The rest were archived gently, respectfully. I posted a message online, an open letter, with no name. Just a story. If you're around 50 and your mother told you your father didn't care, maybe he did. He just didn't know how to say it loud enough. Weeks passed. No reply, no message. Until one day, a man showed up at the front desk. Quiet. Alone. He said, "I saw the story. I don't know if it's about me, but the dates match and so do the questions." He asked for the letters. All of them. That night, I watched him sit in the same chair where Mr. Bennett used to fold blank pages. He read for hours. Didn't cry, didn't move much. Just held the paper like it was something warm and heavy and almost alive. When he stood to leave, he turned to me and said, "He wrote all this for me?" I nodded. He whispered, "Then I guess he was always there." Just quietly. The last story they remembered. Her eyes were almost always closed now. Her hands folded, her voice a whisper that barely stirred the air. Ms. Josephine, 91. Once a school teacher. Once someone's daughter. Someone's wife. Someone's world. Now, mostly a silhouette by the window. A figure too quiet for a room too still. She didn't speak often anymore. Didn't respond to her name, didn't eat much, didn't blink when birds landed on the windowsill. But every afternoon at precisely 4 p.m., she'd ask the same question. "Is the storyteller here yet?" The nurses thought she was confusing memories, that maybe she was recalling a radio show, or her days reading to children in class. But the truth was simpler and deeper, because she wasn't asking for a storyteller. She was asking for me. When I walked into her room one day, she looked right at me, clear-eyed, and said, "You've been listening, haven't you?" I nodded, unsure. She continued, "It's not easy, you know, carrying everyone else's truths. You hold them like fragile glass, carefully, so they don't break." Then she smiled. "But even glass gets heavy." I sat down beside her, like I had with so many others. But this time she spoke first. And she told me things. Not about her childhood, not about her career, not about places she'd been or people she'd lost. She spoke about me. You come in quiet, but you leave the room warmer. You listen like it's the most important thing in the world. You remind us we're still people, not just names on door plates. I was stunned. I thought, "You didn't remember me." She smiled. "I don't remember what day it is. I don't remember the president's name. I don't even remember what I had for breakfast. But I remember how you made me feel. And that is the last thing to go." Then she asked me something I'll never forget. "When I go, what story will you tell of me?" I didn't answer right away. So she whispered, "Tell them I listened too. That before I left, I remembered you. Tell them my last story was yours." She passed that evening. Peaceful. Sunlight catching her face just right. Her hands still folded. Her lips curled into the gentlest smile. I sat by her bed for hours. Not writing, not thinking, just holding space for everything she left behind. And when I stood, I realized something. I had come here to listen. But somewhere along the way, I had become the story myself. Not because I was special, not because I deserved it, but because they trusted me, in their most fragile hours, to carry their last whispers into the world. Now, when people ask me what I do, I never say, I work at a nursing home. I never say I help the elderly, or I manage memory care. I just say, I remember before they forgot. Some people leave scars, others leave lessons. Burn and reborn stories that break you, then rebuild you.